On the 103rd day of my marriage, I got a phone call from a luxury bridal preservation studio. The woman on the other end sounded perfectly cheerful. "Mrs. Vale, your husband's gown is ready. Would you like us to send it back to the usual address?" I froze. "I think you have the wrong person." There was no reason my husband should have a wedding dress at a preservation studio. The dress I wore to our wedding had been donated the day after the ceremony. The woman paused and checked her records. "No, ma'am, I have Adrian Vale listed here." Then she added something that made my stomach drop. "He's been using our preservation service for this same gown for almost 4 years." 4 years. I had known Adrian for less than 6 months, which meant long before he met me. My husband had been carefully preserving another woman's wedding dress, not keeping it in a box in the attic, not forgetting it in the back of a closet. He was paying professionals to clean it, inspect it, repackage it, and keep it in perfect condition. Month after month, year after year, I swallowed. "Is there a name attached to the gown?" The woman hesitated. "Yes." I waited. "Lydia Hart." I had never heard that name before. That night, I stood at the end of the upstairs hallway, staring at the one door in Adrian's house that had always been locked. When I first moved in, he told me it was just storage. Old things, things he didn't use anymore. I had never asked him to open it. I didn't think I had the right. Because Adrian and I hadn't married for love. Our marriage had started as a business arrangement, and I had always told myself his past was none of my business. But that night I finally understood that locked room wasn't full of old things. It was holding on to a woman he had never really let go of, and 3 weeks later that woman came back. The first time Adrian saw her again, his arm was around my waist. Then Lydia walked into the room, and without even realizing he was doing it, my husband slowly let go of me. That was the moment I understood something I had been trying very hard not to see. A woman could be gone for 4 years and still have more space in my husband's heart than his actual wife. What I didn't know yet was that a few months later, Adrian would be the one asking me not to leave. My name is Nora Ellis. I was 29 years old when all of this happened. Before I married Adrian Vale, I owned a struggling little bookstore called The Lantern. It had belonged to my mother. It wasn't impressive, 2 floors, old wooden shelves. A faded sign above the door. The front windows leaked cold air every winter. The basement smelled damp whenever it rained, and our coffee machine seemed to break every other week. But I loved that place. I grew up there. When I was 8, I used to hide under the register and read romance novels I definitely wasn't old enough to understand. When I was 17 and had my first heartbreak, I spent an entire afternoon crying on the old couch in the back while my mother priced books and listened to me complain about a boy she already knew wasn't worth it. After she died, everyone told me to sell the store. Financially, they were probably right. The Lantern had been losing money for almost 2 years. But I couldn't do it. As long as I could unlock that door every morning, it still felt like a part of my mother was there. Then my landlord told me he was selling the building. If I wanted to keep the bookstore, I had 4 months to come up with $400,000. I didn't have $400,000, I barely had $40,000. So I worked constantly. I ran the bookstore during the day and did freelance copywriting and event work at night. That second job was how I met Adrian Vale. Adrian was 33. His family owned Vale Hospitality, a luxury hotel company with properties across the country. Business magazines like to call him ruthless, cold obsessed with work. After meeting him, I understood why. The first time we were in the same room, I was presenting a campaign for one of his company's charity programs. Everyone around the table kept telling him how brilliant the plan was. I was the only person who pointed out that one of the numbers in the presentation was misleading. The room went silent. Adrian stared at me long enough that I was pretty sure I'd just lost my job. After the meeting, he walked over. "Aren't you worried about offending the client?" "Yes." "Then why did you say it?" "Because the number was wrong." He looked at me for a second. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. "Barely. You're probably in the wrong business, and you're probably not very good at hearing the word no." That was our first real conversation over the next couple of months. I saw him a few more times because of work. We weren't friends. We definitely weren't dating. We were just 2 people who happened to keep ending up in the same meetings. Then came the anniversary gala at one of his family's hotels. At the end of the night, the entrance was packed with reporters. I was walking down the front steps when someone bumped into me from behind. My heel slipped. I started to fall. Adrian happened to be standing next to me. He caught me around the waist, The whole thing lasted maybe 3 seconds. Unfortunately, 3 seconds was enough. By the next morning, pictures of us were everywhere. Vale, Heir's mystery girlfriend revealed. Who is the woman who finally tamed Adrian Vale? One article actually used the words secret romance. I almost choked on my coffee. The ridiculous part was that the story helped Adrian. At the time, Vale Hospitality was preparing for a major acquisition. Adrian was also trying to convince the board that he should eventually take over as CEO. Some board members thought he was too aggressive, too unpredictable, too consumed by work. Apparently, being photographed with a woman made him look more stable, more relatable. His approval numbers went up. 3 days later, Adrian asked me to dinner. I assumed he wanted to discuss a public statement. Instead, he slid a contract across the table. The first page said, "Marriage agreement." I read about half a page before I laughed. "You want me to marry you?" "Yes." "How many times have we even met?" "7. You don't even know my birthday." "June 17th. That shut me up for a second. Still, not the point. The agreement was for 12 months. For 1 year, we would appear publicly as husband and wife. We would live in the same house but sleep in separate rooms. We would attend company and family events together when necessary. Outside of that, we would stay out of each other's personal lives. At the end of the year, we would file for divorce quietly. And in exchange, Adrian would pay me enough money to buy the building that housed the lantern. I didn't say yes. Not at first. The whole thing sounded insane. Why don't you just marry someone who actually wants to marry you? His answer came immediately. Someone who wants me would expect me to love her. That sentence destroyed whatever tiny romantic fantasy I might have had about him. I stood up. I was halfway to the door when he said my name. "Nora." I stopped. "You need $400,000. That night, I sat behind the register at the lantern until after 1 in the morning. My landlord had texted me again. Another buyer had made an offer on the building. If I couldn't put down a deposit within a month, he wasn't going to hold it for me. There was a photograph of my mother hanging behind the counter. She was holding a stack of books and laughing at something outside the frame. At 1:15 a.m., I called Adrian. "I'll do it." He didn't sound surprised. "What are your conditions?" 3. "I'm listening. First, whatever you do outside this marriage is your business, but I will not be publicly humiliated." "Fine." "Second, my bookstore and my family are off limits. You don't use them for publicity." "Agreed." "Third, you don't have to love me, but you do have to be honest with me." There was a short pause. Then he said, "Deal." 3 weeks later, we got married. The wedding was beautiful. Almost too beautiful. The rooftop of one of the Vale hotels was covered in white roses. There were reporters everywhere. I wore a $60,000 designer wedding gown on loan from a fashion house. Adrian stood beside me and held my hand for every photograph. If you saw the pictures, you would have thought we were deeply in love. But when the event was over and we went home, we stopped at the stairs. He went one way, I went the other. "Good night, Nora. Good night, Adrian." That was our wedding night. No kiss. No awkward attempt at romance. No pretending. And at first, I liked it that way. I got my bookstore. He got the image he needed. No one owed anyone anything. At least that was the idea. But life has a way of making things complicated when you're most confident they'll stay simple. 2 weeks into the marriage, I worked at the bookstore until almost 11. It was snowing hard. I was standing outside trying to get a ride when a black SUV pulled up. Adrian was in the back seat. "What are you doing here?" My driver was nearby. I believed him. Until his driver casually mentioned a few days later that Adrian had made him take a 40-minute detour to pick me up. 5 weeks into the marriage, I had a terrible stomach attack in the middle of the night. I tried to walk downstairs for medicine and ended up having to lean against the wall just to stay upright. Adrian had just gotten home. The second he saw me, he dropped his briefcase and drove me straight to the ER. The doctor asked whether I skipped meals often. Adrian looked more annoyed than the doctor. The next evening, there were 2 dinners waiting in the kitchen, and the night after that, and the night after that, when I asked if he had told the chef to start cooking for me, he shrugged. "It's no harder to make 2 servings than 1. I let him pretend that was the reason. Then I started noticing more little things. He remembered I drank my latte without sugar. He learned I hated the smell of lilies, and somehow lilies stopped appearing in the house. One Saturday, the Lantern hosted a children's reading event. Adrian had agreed to stop by for 10 minutes so the company photographer could get a few pictures. Then an 8-year-old boy grabbed his sleeve and asked him to read a story. Adrian stayed for almost an hour. He was a terrible storyteller. His voice was too serious. He read every line like he was presenting quarterly earnings. The kids loved him anyway. After the event, we sat on the steps outside the bookstore and ate pizza from the box. No cameras, no board members, no family. He took off his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves. For the first time, he didn't feel like someone from another world. Somewhere along the way, I started waiting for him to come home. I got used to seeing 2 coffee mugs in the kitchen. When I bought something, I caught myself wondering if he would like it too. One night I fell asleep on the couch. When I woke up, his jacket was covering me. Adrian was sitting nearby, working on his laptop. "Why didn't you wake me?" "You're quieter when you sleep, so I'm annoying when I'm awake?" "A little." I threw a pillow at him. He laughed. And that was the first time I had the dangerous thought. Maybe a relationship didn't have to begin with love to become love. Maybe this could turn into something real. Maybe we wouldn't have to end it after 12 months. Then came day 103. And the phone call about the wedding dress. When Adrian came home that night, I placed the bridal studio's business card on the dining table. The moment he saw the name, his face changed. I didn't bother easing into it. "Who is Lydia Hart?" He didn't pretend he didn't know. He sat down and stayed quiet for a long time. Then he told me. Lydia was his former fiancée. They had known each other for 9 years. They had dated for 7. 4 years earlier, they were supposed to get married. 8 days before the wedding, Lydia disappeared. No argument, no face-to-face goodbye, just a short letter. She said she couldn't handle becoming part of the Vale family. She didn't want to live under constant public attention. And she was afraid she would eventually become one more piece of Adrian's life that had been scheduled, managed, and controlled. Then she moved to France, changed her number, and didn't come back. "What about the dress?" "It was already finished." "So you kept it?" "Yes, for 4 years." "Yes, and you've been paying to preserve it this whole time?" He didn't answer right away. "Why?" Another long silence. Finally, he said, "I don't know." I almost wished he had said he still loved her. At least that would have been an answer. "I don't know" was worse. Because it meant he had never forced himself to think about it. It meant she still occupied a part of his life that he refused to examine. I didn't demand that he throw the dress away. I didn't scream. I just said one thing. "If she ever comes back, tell me what you actually want." He looked at me. "I'm not competing with another woman for my own husband. She's not coming back." 3 weeks later, Lydia came back. It happened at Vale Hospitality's annual charity gala. I was wearing a dark blue dress. Adrian had spent most of the evening beside me. Whenever photographers approached, his hand rested naturally around my waist. By then, the gesture didn't even feel fake anymore. Then the room near the entrance suddenly went quieter. I followed everyone's attention. A woman had just walked in, black dress, honey blonde hair, beautiful in the kind of way that didn't require effort, but she wasn't what I noticed first. I noticed Adrian. His entire body went still. His hand, which had been resting on my waist, slowly dropped away. I didn't need to ask. I already knew. Lydia walked directly toward us. She stopped in front of Adrian. "Long time no see." He took a few seconds to answer. "When did you get back?" "Today." Then she looked at me. "You must be Nora." I smiled. "I am." Adrian was distracted for the rest of the evening. On the drive home, he barely spoke. I didn't ask questions. The next day, Lydia called him. She wanted to explain why she had left. He went to see her. When he came home, he told me. I said, "Okay." She called again 2 days later. Then she stopped by his office. Then they had lunch. At first, Adrian told me every time they met. Eventually, he stopped mentioning it unless I asked. Technically, he wasn't lying, but when someone only tells you the truth after you pull it out of them, it starts to feel a lot like hiding. The first time he truly disappointed me was the day I signed the papers to buy the lantern. I had waited years for that day. That morning I wore one of my mother's old blue coats. Adrian had promised to meet me at the attorney's office. We were supposed to sign at 3. 3:20 came, no Adrian. 3:40, still nothing. At 4 I called him, no answer. At 4:30 his assistant finally called me. Lydia had shown up in the company parking garage having what looked like a severe panic attack. Adrian had taken her to the hospital. The attorney told me the documents still needed to be signed that day, so I signed them alone. When they handed me the keys, everyone in the office congratulated me. I smiled, I thanked them. Then I walked outside and stood on the sidewalk holding the keys I had dreamed about for years, and somehow I felt almost nothing. The first person I wanted there had chosen to be somewhere else. Adrian didn't get home until after 11. He apologized over and over. He told me Lydia's condition had been serious. I understand. He frowned. Why do you always say that? I looked at him. What? You always say you understand. He actually sounded frustrated. Aren't you angry? I stared at him. You want me to be angry? At least then I'd know you care. For a second I almost laughed. He was the one who had let me down, and somehow I was supposed to perform enough pain to prove that he mattered to me. Adrian, I am angry. Then why don't you act like it? Because I'm not going to compete with another woman to see who can need you more. He said nothing. I kept going. If I cry harder than she does, do I get you for the night? If she has a worse crisis tomorrow, do you go back to her? How exactly am I supposed to win a marriage like that? We didn't say goodnight to each other. For the first time since we got married, the distance between our bedrooms felt enormous. Over the next few days, things got worse. Adrian saw Lydia less often, but I could tell his mind was still there. He wanted an explanation. He wanted to understand why she had abandoned him 4 years earlier, and I was waiting for him to understand what he wanted now. Then, a photograph appeared online. Adrian and Lydia were leaving a restaurant together. Her hand was wrapped around his arm. The headline read, "First Love Returns, is the vow marriage already over?" That night, Adrian explained that Lydia had almost slipped on the sidewalk and grabbed him. I believed him, but I still asked the question I had been avoiding. If there had never been a marriage contract between us, would you have chosen to marry me? He looked at me, and he hesitated, only for a few seconds. But sometimes a few seconds are enough. If your wife asks, "Would you choose me?" and you need time to think about it, she already has her answer. I nodded. Okay. He caught my wrist. Nora, it's not what you think. Then what is it? He couldn't tell me. I pulled my hand away. 2 days later, everything exploded. My phone started ringing at 6 in the morning. Dozens of calls, messages, notifications. I opened the news. Someone had leaked our marriage contract. The $400,000, the 12-month term, the public appearances, the planned divorce. It was all there. People went insane. They called me a gold digger, a fraud, a woman who had sold herself to marry into money. Some people even claimed Adrian had bought my bookstore for me. Strangers showed up outside the lantern to film videos. One woman threw a cup of coffee against the front window and looked into her phone camera. This is the store she bought by selling herself. I arrived through the back entrance. My best friend Megan was shaking with anger. I felt strangely calm, because there were only a handful of people who had ever seen that contract. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this on purpose. Adrian came home around 9 that morning. He told me the company was investigating the leak. When are you going to respond? He hesitated. The board wants us to wait 24 hours. Why? There's an acquisition vote tomorrow. I stared at him. If we confirm the contract now, it could affect the deal. And what happens to me for the next 24 hours? Nora. It's 1 day. I don't know what made me ask the next question. Maybe I already knew the answer. If this were Lydia being destroyed online, would you tell her to wait 1 day too? His expression changed. This has nothing to do with Lydia. And just like that, something in me went quiet. Not because he had defended her, because I finally saw the pattern. Since the day I met Adrian, I had been waiting. Waiting for him to finish working. Waiting for him to be emotionally available. Waiting for him to deal with his family. Waiting for him to deal with his past. Waiting for him to decide what Lydia meant to him. And now even my dignity had to wait until his board finished a meeting. I went upstairs and pulled out a suitcase. Adrian followed me. What are you doing? Leaving. Our agreement still has 6 months left. I stopped packing. I'll return the portion of the money I haven't earned. His face changed. You think this is about the money? I gave a short laugh. Wasn't it always about money? This marriage started as a transaction. Only I made one really stupid mistake. He went still. I looked down at the sweater in my hands. I started believing it was real. That was the first time I admitted it. His face softened immediately. Nora, I started waiting for you to come home. I started buying your coffee without thinking. The day I bought the bookstore, I had actually been thinking that maybe when the 12 months were over, we could tear up the agreement. My voice cracked. I thought maybe we could just stay married. His eyes turned red, but I kept packing. I don't want that anymore. Nora, please. I sold you 12 months of my time. I looked at him. I did not sell you my self-respect, and I'm not going to stand here while you keep checking whether your past still wants you and then come back to see if I'm still waiting. I closed my suitcase. Then I left. It was raining outside. Reporters were still waiting near the house. Cameras flashed the moment I stepped out. Someone shouted, asking if Adrian had thrown me out. Someone else yelled, asking how much money I had made. I didn't answer. I was wearing an expensive pair of heels that day. A block away from the house. One of them broke in a puddle. So I took them both off, and I walked the rest of the way barefoot in the rain. 4 months earlier, I had stood in front of the same kind of cameras wearing a wedding dress. Everyone said I was lucky. Now strangers were telling me I had never deserved him. And standing there in the rain, I suddenly realized how ridiculous that was. Other people's opinion of your relationship has absolutely nothing to do with how that relationship feels when you're the one living inside it. For the next 6 days, I slept in the small room above the bookstore. I didn't answer Adrian's calls. I didn't respond to his messages, and yes, I was heartbroken. I wasn't numb. I wasn't secretly relieved. I loved him. That was what made leaving so painful. If I had never cared about him, walking away would have been easy. But I remembered the night he drove me to the ER, the snowstorm when he took a 40-minute detour just to pick me up. The afternoon he sat with a group of kids and read an entire book, even though he clearly had no idea how to make the voices interesting. Those moments had been real, too. That was why the disappointment hurt so much. On the 6th afternoon, Megan turned on the television. Vale Hospitality was holding a press conference. Adrian stood alone at the podium. No PR team beside him. No board members. No family. The first reporter asked the obvious question. Mr. Vale, do you admit that your marriage to Nora Ellis was a financial arrangement? Yes. The room erupted. He waited, then continued. But the arrangement was my idea. I was the person who benefited professionally from that marriage. Nora did not mislead anyone. She fulfilled an agreement that I asked her to enter. Another reporter called out. So she did marry you for $400,000? Adrian paused. She accepted the amount we agreed on in advance. Then he looked directly toward the cameras. But I took something from her that was worth far more than $400,000. What? Her trust? I started crying, not because I was ready to go back. I wasn't. I cried because for the first time, he had finally stood up and taken responsibility without asking me to wait. That same day, Adrian withdrew from consideration for CEO. The board had ordered him to remain silent until after the acquisition vote. He refused. The company also opened an investigation into the contract leak. Eventually, they traced it back to Lydia. She had gotten a copy through a former PR executive she knew. According to Megan, Lydia admitted that she wanted Adrian to see that I had never married him for love. Adrian ended whatever relationship remained between them. Later, Megan told me Lydia asked him, "Are you throwing me away because of her?" And Adrian answered, "No. I'm walking away because I finally understand that if a relationship has to keep hurting someone else to prove it matters, then it stopped being love a long time ago." When Megan told me, I didn't suddenly forgive Adrian. Lydia's betrayal didn't erase his choices. She had done something terrible. But Adrian had still been the one who repeatedly expected me to wait. 2 weeks later, he came to the bookstore. He didn't walk inside. He waited outside until I came out. Then he handed me a small box. Inside was a key. I recognized it immediately. The key to the locked room at the end of the hallway. "Why are you giving me this?" "The room is empty now." I looked at him. "What happened to the dress?" "I gave it back to Lydia." That surprised me. He hadn't burned it. He hadn't cut it up. He hadn't made some dramatic show out of destroying it. He had simply returned it to the person it belonged to. And somehow, that felt more final. "Nora, I'm not here to ask you to come home. I didn't say anything. I just wanted you to know that door isn't locked anymore." Then he left. And after that, he actually gave me space. No daily flowers. No midnight phone calls. No sitting outside my building all night, no dramatic speeches. At first, that almost confused me. I had grown up on stories where a man messes up, then proves his love by chasing the woman until she gives in. But I started to understand something. Sometimes respect doesn't look like chasing someone. Sometimes respect means stopping, giving them room, accepting the consequences, and changing the things that needed to change whether they come back or not. Adrian and I stayed apart for 6 months. I focused on the lantern. I renovated the front half and added a small coffee counter. We started hosting a women's book club every Wednesday. Children's Story Hour became a weekend event. Slowly, the business got better, and for the first time I realized that even without Adrian, I could build a good life. I even took a trip by myself. 5 days on the coast of Maine. I walked every morning, read in the afternoons, ate seafood at little restaurants where nobody knew my name. Nobody called me Mrs. Vale. Nobody asked where my husband was. Nobody cared about our contract. I was just Nora, and I liked her. During those 6 months, Adrian sent me exactly 3 messages. The first came when the lantern reopened after the renovation. "Congratulations, you did it." The second came on my birthday. "Happy birthday, Nora." The third came near the end of the 6th month. "My attorney has prepared the divorce papers. Whenever you're ready, I'll sign them." I stared at that message for a long time, then for the first time since I left, I answered him. "Thank you." We didn't really see each other again until the 7th month. A pipe burst in the bookstore basement late one evening. Half our inventory was sitting in water. I posted in a neighborhood group asking if anyone had fans, pumps, or extra hands. People started showing up. Around 11 that night, I carried a box of wet books upstairs, and there he was, Adrian, standing at the back of the crowd. No suit, old jeans, sneakers. Holding a mop. "What are you doing here?" Megan shared the post. Then he asked me something the old Adrian never would have asked. "If you don't want me here, I'll leave." I stared at him. For years, Adrian had been the kind of person who decided what was best and expected everyone else to adjust. Now he was asking. I looked toward the basement. "There's still a lot of water down there." He nodded. "Got it." And he went downstairs. We worked until after 1 in the morning. Eventually, everyone else left. Adrian sat on the bookstore floor with his jeans soaked to the knees. I handed him a cup of coffee. He took one sip. "No sugar? You don't like sweet coffee." He smiled. "I do now a little. Since when?" He shrugged. "People change," I laughed. So did he. It was the first time we had laughed together since I left. After a while, he looked at me. "Are you doing okay?" "I am." He nodded. "Good." That was all. He didn't ask if I missed him. He didn't ask if I regretted leaving. He didn't ask whether we still had a chance. He just wanted to know if I was okay. After that, we started talking once in a while. At first, maybe once a month, then every couple of weeks. Sometimes we got coffee. Sometimes he came into the bookstore and bought a novel I knew he would never actually read. I knew he was making excuses to see me. I let him. We started getting to know each other like two people who had never been married. No contract, no board, no cameras, no expectation. One afternoon, I finally asked him something. "Do you regret giving up the CEO position?" "Yes." His answer surprised me. "I wanted it for a long time." "Then why did you walk away?" He thought about it. "Because I eventually realized losing the job wasn't the real cost." "What was?" He looked at me. I almost became someone I couldn't respect. That was the first moment I truly looked at Adrian and thought, he isn't the same man I left. 9 months after our separation, he asked me to dinner. Afterward, we walked back toward the bookstore. At the door, he stopped. "Nora." "Yeah? Can I date you?" I laughed. "Adrian, we were married." "I know, that's why I want to start over." I folded my arms. "And what exactly does starting over look like?" "Last time, we started with a contract." He smiled. "This time, I was hoping we could start with coffee." I didn't answer right away. He didn't push. Finally, I said, "1 coffee." The next afternoon, he showed up with exactly 1 coffee. No flowers, no ring, no driver waiting outside, no reporters. We sat near the front window of the lantern and talked for an hour about childhood. About my mother, about why Adrian had spent most of his life terrified of failure. It was strange. We had been married for months, and somehow this was the first time we had ever really dated. We didn't magically become perfect. I still had trust issues. When he answered a text late, part of me remembered Lydia. Whenever someone mentioned his past, I still felt that old discomfort. Once we got into an argument over something stupid. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. The old Adrian probably would have blocked me or tried to force the conversation right then. This time, he stayed where he was. "You can leave." I stopped. "But when you're ready, if you want to, I'd like us to finish this conversation." I stood there with my hand on the door, and I realized something. Feeling safe with someone doesn't mean they promise they will never hurt your feelings. No one can promise that. Safety means that when things get hard, you know they won't disappear. They won't punish you with silence. They won't run to someone else. They won't leave you guessing whether you still matter. A year after we signed our original marriage agreement, the contract officially expired. The attorney asked whether we wanted to cancel the divorce process and stay married. Adrian looked at me, then said, "No, we should finish it." The attorney looked surprised. I smiled. "I agree. So we divorced, for real." I didn't cry when I signed the papers. I felt lighter, because sometimes the wrong beginning has to fully end before there's room for something better. 3 months later, Adrian proposed, not at a luxury hotel. No photographers, no private jet, no giant sign. It happened after closing time at the Lantern. Snow was falling outside. He pulled one of my mother's favorite old novels off the shelf and handed it to me. When I opened it, there was a simple ring inside. "The first time I married you, I needed a wife." I looked up. "This time, I want to marry you because I want a life with you." I started crying. Then I laughed. "Is there another contract?"
Yes.
I stopped crying. "What?" He pulled a folded piece of paper out of his coat. There were only 3 lines. 1. We don't let the past make decisions for our future. 2. We don't use silence instead of communication. 3. If one of us is unhappy, we sit down and talk before we walk away. At the bottom were 2 blank signature lines. I laughed so hard I had tears running down my face. Then I signed, Nora Ellis, and handed him the pen. 3 months later, we got married again. No press, no hotel ballroom, just 20-something people we actually loved in the little courtyard behind the bookstore. I wore a simple white dress. Adrian stood under the trees waiting for me. After the ceremony, he took my hand. "So, Mrs. Vale? How does it feel this time? More expensive?" He looked confused. "How?" "Last time I got $400,000. I smiled. "This time I'm doing it for free." He laughed so hard half the guests turned to look at us. Eventually, we turned the locked room in his house into a reading room. One entire wall became bookshelves. We put a couch by the window. On Sunday mornings, I curl up there with a novel while Adrian brings in 2 cups of coffee. The door is never locked. Sometimes I still think about what that room used to hold. For years, it had contained the physical remains of a relationship Adrian couldn't let go of. Now it's just part of our home. I used to think the most important question in love was, who does he choose in the end? I don't think that anymore. A man coming back to you doesn't automatically mean you won. The real question is whether he knows how to end relationships that should be over, whether he can admit when he was wrong, whether he can take responsibility without making you pay for his mistakes, and whether after losing you, he's actually learning how to love better or just panicking because you're gone. My biggest change wasn't forgiving Adrian. It was realizing that I never had to suffer quietly to prove I was worthy of love. You can be kind, you can be patient, you can give someone a second chance, but kindness does not mean having no boundaries. Understanding someone does not mean waiting forever. And loving someone does not mean standing still while they deal with their ex, their job, their family, their fears, and every other part of their life before finally deciding whether you matter. Healthy love is 2 people moving toward each other. If only one person is moving, that isn't love. That's waiting. So if you ever find yourself constantly coming second to someone's job, their past, their ex, their family, or anything else, don't immediately ask, "What can I do to make them love me more?" Ask yourself something else. Is someone who constantly makes me question whether I'm worth choosing really someone I should keep choosing? I entered my first marriage for $400,000. Later, I almost paid for that decision with my self-respect. Leaving saved me from doing that. And in the end, what made me trust Adrian again wasn't the press conference. It wasn't giving up the CEO position. It wasn't returning Lydia's wedding dress. And it definitely wasn't how many times he said he was sorry. It was what he did after I told him I might never come back. He stopped performing. He stopped chasing. And he changed the parts of himself that needed changing, even though there was no guarantee I would ever reward him for it. So when people ask me whether someone who hurt you deserves a second chance, this is what I tell them. Don't look at how hard they cry after losing you. Don't count how many times they say they regret it. Don't look at how much money they spend trying to prove they love you. Watch what they do when you haven't promised to come back. If they still take responsibility, if they still do the work, if they still become better even when they might never get you back, then maybe the change is real. Because real love isn't. Please don't leave me. Sometimes real love sounds more like, even if you never come back, I know what I did wrong. And I never want to be that person again. My first marriage started with a contract. My second marriage started with love. I used to believe a happy ending meant never taking a wrong turn. Now I know better. Everyone gets lost sometimes. The lucky ones are the people who have enough courage to stop when they realize they're heading in the wrong direction. And when I finally looked back at Adrian, he wasn't standing in the same place waiting for me. He had been moving too. He had learned how to love someone without controlling them. And I had learned how to love someone without abandoning myself. So this time we both took a step toward each other. No contract, no transaction, no locked room, no woman from the past standing between us. Just two people who finally met each other again, at the right time as better versions of themselves.